The glass walls of the conference room on the 38th floor of Mabeso Holdings Tower looked out over the busy skyline of Johannesburg, South Africa. Inside the room, nearly 40 employees sat around a long table, waiting for the quarterly meeting to begin. At the head of the table stood Bekazizwe Mabeso, the billionaire founder and owner of the company. Everyone in the building knew his reputation. He was brilliant, powerful, and extremely intimidating. People rarely spoke when he was in the room unless he asked them a direct question. Near the far end of the table sat 27-year-old Zola Ndlovu. She kept her posture straight and her expression calm, quietly taking notes like she always did. Zola worked as a junior administrative assistant, one of the lowest positions in the company. Many employees had always found that strange. After all, she was married to Thato Mabeso, the only son of the billionaire owner. Whispers about her had spread around the office for months. Why would the boss's daughter-in-law work such a small job? Maybe she married him for money. Maybe she's just lucky. But Zola never reacted to the gossip. She simply came to work every day, did her tasks, and stayed quiet. The meeting had been going on for almost 30 minutes when something unexpected happened. Bekazizwe suddenly stopped speaking in the middle of reviewing financial reports. His sharp eyes slowly moved across the room until they landed directly on Zola. A slow, mocking smile appeared on his face. He raised his hand and pointed at her. "This woman right here," he said loudly, his deep voice echoing through the silent room. Every employee turned their heads. Zola felt dozens of eyes land on her. Bekazizwe let out a short laugh. "She married into my family," he continued, shaking his head. "Yet she contributes absolutely nothing to this company." A few nervous chuckles escaped from the room, but most people stayed silent. Then he said the words that froze the entire meeting. "Completely worthless." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence so heavy it felt like the air had stopped moving. Several employees looked down at the table, clearly embarrassed for her. Others glanced at Zola with sympathy. No one expected the boss to humiliate his own daughter-in-law in front of the entire office. But Zola didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply sat there, calm and quiet, her hands resting on the notebook in front of her. What nobody in that room understood was that the quiet woman they were staring at was hiding a truth powerful enough to shake the entire company. And very soon, everyone in Mabeso Holdings was going to find out who Zola Ndlovu really was. After that painful meeting, many people in the office began whispering about Zola even more. Some felt sorry for her while others believed what the billionaire boss had said. But the truth about Zola Ndlovu was something very few people understood. Zola had never been the kind of person who liked attention. Long before she ever came to Johannesburg, she had grown up in Gaborone, Botswana. Her childhood was simple, quiet, and far away from the world of billionaires and corporate towers. Her mother, who raised her alone after Zola's father passed away when she was young, always taught her the same lesson again and again. Never measure your value by what people say about you. Her mother believed that real strength was quiet. She often told Zola, "You don't need to prove yourself loudly. The right time will always reveal the truth." Those words stayed with Zola as she grew older. Life was not always easy for them. Her mother worked long hours, sometimes holding 2 jobs just to make sure Zola could study and have a better future. Because of that, Zola learned patience, discipline, and humility very early in life. She never forgot where she came from. Years later, when Zola met Thato Mabeso, their relationship surprised many people. Thato was the son of one of the richest men in South Africa, and his family lived in a world of luxury that Zola had never experienced before. Expensive cars, huge homes, powerful connections. It was a completely different life. When they got married, people around them immediately started making assumptions. She must have married him for money. She hit the jackpot. Her life is set forever now. But those people didn't know Zola at all. Even after marrying into the Mabeso family, Zola refused to live off their wealth. She didn't want to be known as the billionaire's daughter-in-law. She wanted to build something of her own. That was exactly why she applied for a regular job at Mabeso Holdings like any other employee. She didn't ask for a high position. She didn't use her husband's name to get special treatment. Instead, she chose a small administrative role where she could quietly learn how the company actually worked from the inside. To Zola, it was a chance to grow. But to her father-in-law, Bekazizwe Mabeso, it looked very different. In his eyes, power meant ambition, authority, and visible success. Someone who stayed quiet in the background didn't look strong to him. It looked like weakness. And every time he saw Zola sitting quietly at her small desk, doing simple tasks, It only confirmed what he already believed. To him, she wasn't impressive. She wasn't ambitious. She wasn't powerful. She was simply the quiet daughter-in-law who, in his mind, brought nothing valuable to the Mabeso empire. What he didn't realize was that the quiet woman he kept underestimating had spent years building something far bigger than anyone in that building could imagine. Years before Zola ever stepped inside the tall glass tower of Mabeso Holdings in Johannesburg, she had lived a very different life in another city. Back then she was in Nairobi, Kenya, a fast-growing tech hub where young entrepreneurs were building companies that were changing Africa's future. But almost no one in her new life knew about that chapter. When Zola first moved to Nairobi in her early 20s, she wasn't rich and she didn't have powerful connections. What she did have was something many investors were always searching for: sharp instincts and a deep understanding of people and ideas. She had a natural ability to look at a small, struggling startup and see the potential everyone else missed. At first, she worked behind the scenes with a small venture capital group that focused on early-stage African technology companies. Her role was simple on paper: review business plans, study market trends, and help decide which startups were worth supporting. But very quickly, the senior partners noticed something unusual about her. Zola had a gift for spotting the next big idea before it became obvious to everyone else. More than once, she recommended investing in startups that other investors had completely ignored. A small mobile payment platform, a digital farming marketplace, a logistics app that connected small businesses across East Africa. At the time, those companies were tiny and struggling. Some people even laughed at the ideas. But a few years later, those same startups exploded in growth. Millions of users joined their platforms. International investors rushed to put money into them. Suddenly, they were being called some of the most successful tech companies in the region. Inside the venture capital firm, Zola's reputation quietly grew stronger and stronger. However, there was one important detail that kept her completely out of the spotlight. All of her work was protected under strict confidential partnership agreements. The venture fund preferred to keep its key strategists anonymous, especially those working on sensitive early investments. Zola herself also preferred it that way. She never cared about public attention or media interviews. While the founders of those startups appeared in magazines and on business news channels, Zola stayed invisible. No photos, no public credit, no headlines with her name. But behind closed doors, powerful investors across Nairobi knew exactly who she was. When big investment decisions were being discussed, people often asked one question: what does Zola think about this company? Her opinion carried weight even if the public never saw her face. By the time she eventually left Nairobi, several of the companies she had helped support were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Some were expanding across Africa. Yet when Zola later moved to Johannesburg and quietly started working at Mabeso Holdings as a junior employee, nobody there had the slightest idea about her past. To them, she was just the boss's quiet daughter-in-law. They had no idea that the same woman organizing meeting notes and filing documents had once helped build some of Africa's fastest-growing tech companies from the ground up. The moment Bekazizwe Mabeso had called her worthless that morning, the news seemed to spread faster than wildfire through Mabeso Holdings. By lunchtime, Zola could feel it. Whispers followed her down every hallway, behind every cubicle. Heads turned when she passed, eyes filled with curiosity, sympathy, or judgment. Some people shook their heads, murmuring, "Poor girl, he was so harsh." Others just shrugged, thinking, "Well, if the boss says it, it must be true." Even though her face remained calm, Zola felt the weight of the room press on her. She had always been quiet, always careful to keep her life separate from the assumptions of others. But now the entire office seemed to be watching, waiting to see how she would react. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and took a deep breath. She had learned long ago not to let people define her. By mid-afternoon, as Zola returned to her small office tucked away in the corner of the tower, something completely unexpected happened. The receptionist approached her, looking slightly flustered. "Ms. Ndlovu? There are some guests here to see you. They're from out of the country." Zola raised an eyebrow. Out-of-country visitors didn't usually come looking for a junior admin. She followed the receptionist to the lobby, where a small group of sharply dressed men and women stood. Their presence immediately commanded attention. They looked confident, powerful, and entirely unbothered by the whispering employees peeking through the glass walls. One of them stepped forward and extended a hand. "Ms. Ndlovu, we've been trying to reach you for weeks. We're investors from Lagos and Accra, and we need to discuss an urgent opportunity with you." Zola's calm demeanor never faltered. She nodded politely and led them toward her office. As she walked, she noticed something strange. People in the office were staring at her like they'd never seen her before. Some looked confused. Others seemed almost afraid. Whispers began again, louder this time. Who are they? And why are they asking for Zola? In that moment, everything shifted. The same woman who had been humiliated that morning, the one everyone had assumed was weak and unimportant, suddenly held the attention of powerful international investors. For the first time that day, Zola smiled, not because she wanted revenge, but because the truth she had quietly carried for years was about to change everything. The office that had doubted her for decades was about to see a side of Zola Ndlovu they never imagined existed. By the next morning, Zola's office was buzzing in a way it never had before. But this time it wasn't because of whispers or gossip. The investors had arrived. They weren't just any visitors. They had flown all the way from Lagos, Nigeria, and Accra, Ghana. Their purpose was serious. A multi-million-dollar expansion deal that could reshape parts of the company. When they first entered the building, the receptionist was completely taken aback. She had no idea why these sharply dressed, confident businesspeople were asking specifically for Zola Ndlovu, a junior administrative employee no one really paid attention to. Confused, she directed them to Zola's small office tucked in the corner of the building. As Zola opened the door and greeted them, the room seemed to shift. These investors didn't speak to her like she was just another employee. They greeted her with deep respect, shaking her hand firmly, making eye contact, and even smiling as if meeting an old trusted partner. Their words carried weight. Their tone hinted at years of familiarity. Employees in the nearby cubicles couldn't help but notice. Heads slowly turned, eyes widening as they watched the scene unfold. One whispered to another, Who are these people? And why do they treat Zola like that? Another muttered, She must be really important, more than we thought. The investors didn't waste time with small talk. They asked Zola detailed questions about ongoing projects, timelines, and company strategies. And every time Zola answered, their nods of approval and the quick scribbles in their notepads showed one thing clearly. They trusted her judgment completely. It was a strange sight for the office. Here was the same young woman everyone had been gossiping about yesterday, humiliated, underestimated, and dismissed by the billionaire boss himself. Yet these powerful figures treated her like the key person in the room, the one whose opinion could make or break a multi-million-dollar deal. Zola remained calm, poised, and collected. She didn't let the stares or whispers distract her. She answered every question confidently, explained strategies clearly, and even suggested a few improvements that impressed the investors further. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear to everyone who had been watching. This wasn't just a quiet, unimportant employee. These international investors knew Zola Ndlovu, and they respected her in a way no one in the office ever had. For the first time, the employees began to realize that the woman they thought they knew was nothing like what they had assumed. The day that had started with whispers of humiliation was quickly turning into a moment of revelation, and Zola was quietly at the center of it all. Later that afternoon, a private meeting was called in one of the sleek boardrooms on the top floor of Mabeso Holdings. Zola walked in with the investors from Lagos and Accra, followed by a few company executives who looked curious and slightly uneasy. Everyone could feel that something big was about to happen, even if they didn't know what. The investors began speaking, their voices calm but full of authority. "We've come to finalize the expansion deal," one of them said. "But first, it's important everyone here understands the role of the person you've been underestimating." Heads turned slowly toward Zola. She remained composed, sitting quietly as they continued. "We've been working with Ms. Ndlovu for years," another investor said, showing a detailed report on a sleek tablet. "She is not just a junior employee. She is one of the founding strategic investors behind a major technology fund that has quietly supported several divisions of Mabeso Holdings over the last few years." The room fell completely silent. The executives exchanged glances, some looking stunned, others confused. Zola's presence at the table suddenly carried a weight no one had ever imagined. The investors explained that Zola's early investments had been crucial for several projects that had propelled Mabeso Holdings forward. A software platform that streamlined logistics, a digital payment system for clients across Africa, even a cloud-based system that had improved the company's efficiency. All of these had been partially funded by her fund. And yet, until that day, no one inside the company had any idea. Zola finally spoke, her voice calm but steady. "I wanted to understand the company from the inside. I wanted to see how things worked day to day, to learn the strengths and weaknesses without relying on my name or wealth. My goal was never to show off, but to contribute quietly and effectively. As the executives absorbed this, the investors continued. Her strategic vision and early financial support have been directly responsible for growth that many in this room take credit for. Ms. Ndlovu's decisions shaped critical projects, expanded markets and increased profits, all without ever appearing publicly. She is the silent force behind what you see today. For the first time, the executives, and even some senior managers, looked at Zola differently. The quiet, modest woman they had overlooked, laughed at, and underestimated was now revealed to be a powerhouse. She wasn't just part of the company, she had helped build its success from the shadows. And in that moment, it became painfully clear that the person Bekazizwe Mabeso had humiliated in front of the entire office was, in fact, one of the most influential forces in the company. When Bekazizwe Mabeso was called into the boardroom, he walked in with his usual confidence. His shoulders were straight, his head held high, and his eyes scanned the room as if he already owned everything inside it, which in truth he did. He gave a sharp nod to the investors and the executives, clearly expecting the usual respect and deference. But as soon as the investors began speaking, the atmosphere in the room shifted. They started detailing Zola's involvement in major ventures, not just in Johannesburg but across Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. They spoke about her strategic investments, her decisions that had guided startups from tiny ideas into multimillion-dollar successes, and the crucial role her fund had played in fueling Mabeso Holdings' growth for years. At first, Bekazizwe's expression remained the same, confident, slightly amused, maybe thinking this was just a formality. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, his smile faded. His eyes narrowed. His jaw tightened. "Wait, are you saying she," he began, his voice catching slightly, "funded this project? And that project?" "Yes," one of the investors replied smoothly. "Her fund has been behind multiple divisions here. Her early support helped scale operations, expand markets, and even increase profits in ways that might not have been possible without her guidance." Bekazizwe's arrogance, the very thing that had allowed him to humiliate Zola publicly just days ago, began to crumble. He leaned back slightly, blinking, trying to process what he was hearing. The woman he had called worthless in front of the entire company was now being described as a major financial power, someone whose decisions had influenced the company's biggest successes. He looked around the room at the executives, then at Zola herself. She sat calmly, composed, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. There was no arrogance, no need to defend herself, just quiet confidence. For the first time, Bekazizwe felt something he rarely did: shock. He had underestimated her completely. All those years he thought she was weak, naive, or dependent on the family name. He had been dead wrong. The room was silent except for the investors' measured explanations. Every detail they shared chipped away at the image of Zola he had created in his mind. She wasn't just competent, she was indispensable, a financial strategist whose influence reached far beyond what he could see. And in that moment, the billionaire who had always demanded respect and control realized something uncomfortable. The person he had humiliated in front of his entire company was someone he could no longer underestimate. Not in any way, shape, or form. For the first time, Bekazizwe Mabeso saw Zola Ndlovu not as his daughter-in-law, but as a force powerful enough to rival him. After the investors finished explaining Zola's role, all eyes in the boardroom turned to her. The executives looked nervous, whispering among themselves. Even Bekazizwe Mabeso, who had just realized the scale of her influence, stared at her, trying to process the truth. Zola remained calm, composed, and unshaken, exactly as she always had been. Finally she spoke, her voice steady and clear. "I know many of you are surprised," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "And I understand why my actions may have seemed quiet or unimportant. But I never wanted anyone to judge me based on my family name." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I married into this family, yes, but I wanted to prove that I could succeed on my own. I wanted to show that my work and decisions mattered because of my abilities, not because of who I married. That's why I chose to work here in a modest role, learning the company from the inside, alongside the people who keep it running every day." Some executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They realized they had misjudged her humility. Zola continued, "Many have thought I was weak or inexperienced. They assumed my quiet nature meant I wasn't capable. But that was never the case. I didn't speak loudly because I didn't need to. I wanted to observe, to understand, and to contribute in meaningful ways without drawing attention to myself. Bekazizwe's eyes softened slightly, though his pride still made it difficult for him to admit he had been wrong. Zola didn't need him to approve or acknowledge her. Her words were meant for everyone in the room, not just for him. I wanted to see the company from the perspective of its employees, not just the executives or the owners, she continued. I wanted to know how things worked at every level so that any decisions I made would be grounded in reality. My goal was never to take credit or to show off. My goal was to make a real difference. A quiet murmur spread through the room. People who had assumed she was unimportant now realized just how wrong they had been. Every detail of her career, every investment and strategy she had led, suddenly made sense in a new light. Zola's humility had been mistaken for weakness, but it was actually her greatest strength. She had proven that true power doesn't need to shout. It quietly changes the world from the shadows. And in that moment, everyone in the room finally understood the woman they had all underestimated. The boardroom was already tense, but the atmosphere grew even heavier as the investors leaned forward, their voices calm but deliberate. There's one more important detail everyone here should know, one of them said. Ms. Ndlova's fund doesn't just support projects quietly, it holds the authority to withdraw millions in investments at any time. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Heads turned toward Zola, whose expression remained composed, almost serene. The executives and managers who had spent years assuming they understood her now sat frozen. Bekazizwe Mabeso, the billionaire who had humiliated her in front of the company just days ago, froze mid-breath, struggling to process what he had just heard. This means, she can pull her investments out? One executive whispered, unable to hide the shock in his voice. Yes, the investor confirmed. Every division she has supported relies in part on her fund. Losing that backing would have immediate financial consequences. Decisions that seemed independent, while many of them have been enabled by her strategic investments. Suddenly, the balance of power inside Mabeso Holdings felt completely different. The employees who had pitted Zola earlier, the ones who had assumed she was weak and unimportant, now stared in stunned silence. Their quiet colleague, the woman who sat in the corner doing small administrative tasks, was quietly holding the company's growth in her hands. Bekazizwe's face shifted from disbelief to something closer to fear. The realization sank in slowly. The person he had publicly called worthless was, in fact, someone who could influence his empire in a single decision. The arrogance and control he had exercised for decades suddenly felt fragile. Zola, however, remained calm. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand attention. Her quiet confidence alone carried weight. She looked around the room, letting everyone absorb the truth. The whispers of pity, the sideways glances, the sneers. They all vanished, replaced by a mix of awe, respect, and a hint of fear. The investors continued, outlining exactly how Zola's fund had guided key projects, financed expansions, and supported the company's growth. Every detail reinforced the same undeniable point. Zola was no longer just a junior employee or a quiet daughter-in-law. She was a central figure whose influence extended far beyond the office walls. By the end of the meeting, one thing was clear. The company Zola had joined as a modest administrator was no longer solely controlled by the man who had belittled her. The balance of power had shifted, quietly but irrevocably, and everyone in that room knew it. Zola Ndlovu was no longer underestimated. She was unstoppable. A few days later, Zola stepped out onto the balcony of Mabeso Holdings' top floor. The city stretched out below her, skyscrapers glittering in the late afternoon sun, traffic flowing like rivers of gold, and the hum of Johannesburg filling the air. She took a deep breath, letting the view sink in, feeling a quiet satisfaction that was completely hers. Inside the building, everything had changed. The whispers and pitying glances that once followed her had vanished. Employees who had doubted her, even laughed at her, now looked at her with a mixture of respect and awe. The quiet woman they had underestimated had revealed herself to be a force they could no longer ignore. Even Bekazizwe Mabeso, her father-in-law, had learned a lesson he would never forget. The arrogance that had allowed him to publicly humiliate her had been shattered by the truth. The woman he had once called worthless was, in fact, one of the most influential minds behind his company's success. She had shaped projects, guided investments, and quietly helped build the empire he took pride in. Zola didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Her confidence came from knowing her own worth, from seeing years of careful planning and hard work finally recognized. She had proven that true power didn't need loud announcements or public praise. It existed quietly in decisions made, strategies followed, and results achieved. As she looked out over the skyline, she felt a sense of freedom she had never experienced before. For the first time, the office understood the truth about her. The same woman they had dismissed and underestimated had transformed not just their perception, but the entire balance of power in the company. Zola Ndlovu had stepped out of the shadows, and now, everyone could see her brilliance. She had earned her place, not through appearances or family ties, but through vision, intelligence, and unwavering patience. And in that moment she smiled, knowing the world would never see her the same way again.